All right, so now that we have all of this sorted out, as you can see, we'll have quite a few more columns of data here. Now for the activity by date, you may remember that we removed the duplicates in the previous exercise. Now we're going to do the same thing here, but we're also going to copy and paste our temperature data. And since our deer activity is part of all of this, we're going to go ahead and copy that as well. We don't have to worry about deleting or removing certain parts of the data because we're always going to have our raw data file just in case. So we have our date here duplicated, and we want to make sure that all of these dates are basically just individual days versus multiple duplicates of the same day. So we're going to go ahead and do this remove duplicate function by going up to data, remove duplicates, and we just want to check mark date. So we want to remove duplicates by date. And the great thing is it conducts that operation across all of these other data points. And then we're going to go ahead and delete this deer activity data over here, because what we're going to do is our SUMIF function as we did before. And the SUMIF function is going to work just like we did. We're going to focus on that date value over there. So we're going to do this equals SUMIF, parentheses, what's our range? What's this date over here? What's our criteria? Well, it's this date over here. Now, there is this cool little function we can do, because we know that in the previous exercise, when we were copying this function downwards, all of this started shifting downwards. And in order to make sure that this stays where it is, just this specific range here, we're going to do this little $ function. We're going to place a $ in front of the A, the 2, the next A, and that 58 over there. Not at the criteria, because that criteria is going to be changing as we drag down. And this basically locks that range in place. Then we're going to select comma, and then select this next sum range, which is our deer activity. And we're going to want to do the same thing with this $ and lock that in place. Whoops, I pressed the button a little too quickly over there. So let me go ahead and do that once again. $, $, $, $, and then I'm going to hit enter. Great, so we have that 4 just as we saw before. And then this time I'm going to copy downwards. Let me double check, make sure the next row is correctly done, and look at that. All of that's remained. Let me look at that one. All of that has remained as before. Now you may say, well, why can't I just copy and paste it from the previous date and time tab? We can do that, but I wanted to demonstrate this whole remove duplicates function to make sure you can see how the minimum and maximum temperature values also get removed along with it. All right, so now we have our temperature by day. What I'm also missing is something in between. I have my min and my max, but it would be really nice to see what the average temperature was on that day. So average is not always the most accurate, because it might be possible that most of our day was hot or maybe cold, but it will be a useful way to get a rough estimate and get that kind of in-between temperature, see what basically these deer were experiencing over the course of this day. So let's go ahead and create this column called average temperature. And I'm going to do equals, and I can either do this average function, which comes ready with Excel, and I'm pretty sure it comes ready with all the other data reporting platforms. And then basically I can do this column or this cell, and then I get an average of the two. Or I can also do equals, open parentheses, this cell plus this cell, close parentheses, and divide by 2. Both of these operations are just fine. They'll do the same. I'm going to copy this average function all the way down. As you saw before, we had 81.795, and we have 81.795 once again. So both of those are just fine. Great. So now we have all of our columns, and we're ready to graph. So as you might have guessed it, we're going to create a line graph over here. So I'm going to do this Control-Shift. The great thing with this Control-Shift is not only does it work down, but it also works to the right. So I don't really have to do any of this clicking and dragging all the way around. But if that's what you're more familiar and comfortable with, go ahead and do that. So we're going to do this Insert, Line Graph, and look at that. That's absolutely great. So now we have all of our temperatures, our minimum, our average, and our maximum, and we have our deer activity all the way down here. Let's go ahead and name this deer activity. Oops. Deer activity by temperature. And then parentheses daily. Now, as you may note, we have this weird phenomenon going over here. We have this deer activity, which is relatively low compared to what we see with our weather patterns going into the mid 90s here. And what we're going to want to do is, in order to be able to compare these different data points, we want to create a second axis. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this deer activity line over here. And as you may see over here on the right hand side, we have this format data series. And I believe you can even right click on this and then select format data series. We'll have this plot series on selector here. And what I want to do is create this as a secondary axis. Look at that. This makes the data a lot easier to review because now we have our deer activity on a completely different axis, so we can really start seeing how the weather data is really impacting our deer activity. Now, what you may also notice is we have a lot of white space here for our temperature. So I would recommend perhaps even shortening this temperature and starting it from this 60. Now, in order to do that, we can work with the axes options. Right now, the minimum is 0, so let's go ahead and enter. I think 60 is going to be a good value. And look at that. So now we have this starting at 60, going up to 100, and we have intervals of 5. And I think intervals of 5 will be a good way to be able to get a rough estimate for how temperature is moving about where we're seeing all this data. But if you want, you can also change your units here from 5 to 1 to 2 or 3, whatever number you really want. And this is absolutely neat to see. Now, I really want to stress the fact that this is only 6 days worth of data points. We only have 60 images, 62 images more specifically, selected from this data series. We had a lot more images over the 6-day period, but for now, we just want to use this as a good guide as we move along. So in this case, we may see that we see a lot of deer activity happening at around an average temperature of around 83. And that may be a really useful data point for you to kind of start gauging whether that may be a more ideal day to go outside. But you may even notice that we also see a generally 63 temperature happening over here. We're seeing quite a bit of deer activity there, but not so much here. So you may want to play around, look at the different types of weather conditions, and later in this video we'll also go over correlation. And once again, we're only basing this off of 60 images, so the more images, the more data you have, the more specific you can get, and the more correlation you really can start deriving from weather impacts on deer activity. Great, so now that we have the data activity, we're going to review our time data. Now the great thing about our time data is we really don't have much to do here other than add our average temperature as we did before. And I'm going to use this average function just because why not? I don't have to play around with all those parentheses. Double click on the bottom, and then we get all of this. And then the next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and sort. So Control Shift to the right, Control Shift down, and then go to my ribbon, Data, Sort. My data does have headers over here, so that's great. This allows me to do this in a shorter period of time, and then sort it by time smallest to largest or earliest to latest. I'm going to go ahead and insert a line graph. I'm going to move this line graph. There's a funky little thing happening here, so let me just click away. Sometimes clicking away helps. Look at that. So let's go ahead and drag this graph over here to the right, and let's give this quite a bit of space just so we can really see what's happening over here. We have quite a few more data points than we did on our daily activity. And then I'm going to go ahead and create a secondary axis over here with these bars. And then I'm going to go to this axis over here, set the minimum for 60. All right, great. So now we have our time and we have our temperature. So let me do deer activity by temperature, and then parentheses, min by min. It's really not a very good title, but you can name this anything you want. It's your data. As I had mentioned before, you can also insert more data points. So maybe you want to insert more rows, or you can play around with the axes. But now we can start getting a good feel for what's happening at different times of day and what kind of weather are we seeing throughout the day over here. And as we can see, as we're looking through, we're having activity from 2 a.m. all the way to just around 8 a.m. and then we have the deer activity starting up again at around 8 p.m. So here's all this data. We have our temperature. You're likely going to want to do this for your wind speed and all the other weather-related conditions as well. And then you can start deriving some really cool patterns from this. I don't want to make too many statements based on what we're seeing here. This is really just based on these 6 days worth of activity. And you may even want to start combining all of these different time intervals. So you may say, you know what, I don't really want to get minute by minute. I may want to just combine these in 15-minute intervals. That may be a little bit more useful for me. And then if you're doing 15-minute intervals, you may then want to place some rows wherever you don't see that specific time happening. So between 8:10 a.m. to 8 p.m., there's 0 data happening. You may want to insert all of these extra rows and then do 8:30, 8:45, 9, and so forth. And then just place 0 for your deer activity and then maybe get an average temperature overall and then just extrapolate it over there. All right, so the last bit we're going to be focusing on is this thing called correlation. So not all variables such as temperature or wind speed have the same impact on deer activity. And the great thing about correlation is it allows us to roughly see which weather-related variables have the most impact on deer activity. Now, in this video, we will just focus on correlation, but there are some more advanced methods to calculating the correlation between variables, which we'll cover in another video. So to begin with, we'll do as we've done time and time again. We'll create a new tab called correlation, just to be as creative as we have been so far. We'll call this correlation, enter. Right, then we'll grab all the data points this time and copy it into this tab. I'm going to, I don't need this camera name right now because I'm not dealing with multiple cameras, so I'm going to go ahead and go from date all the way to pressure, go down, Control C, go to this correlation tab, delete file name, expand my date here, and then as you may remember, in times past we had to split this date and time, and we're going to do the same thing over here. Now before moving forward, I do recommend saving at this point, so a Control S is always a handy thing to do. Now you may have said, well, what's the reason in copying all of these data points? Why didn't you just copy or duplicate this one specific tab? Well, the great thing is Excel does allow you to do that. In fact, it's probably a more secure way of making sure that all of your data points make it into that tab. So the way you can do that is to right-click, go to Move or Copy, move to the end, and then create a copy, and then you select OK, and then you'll see this Raw Data 2 tab over here down here. So let's just use that in effect because we do have this correlation, but I'm going to go ahead and delete it. It's just a good way to show that we can copy all of those, but this is another way to do that. Correlation. We're going to remove the camera name because we don't need that. We're going to remove the file name because we don't need that either. And then we're going to go ahead and do this cut. Go all the way over here to the left. Why do I go to W? There's no real reason to it, just because it happened to be there. I'm going to do Control Shift down, data, text to columns, fixed width, remove the second line over here, make sure that that first line is correctly binding to the end of the date, Great, so now we have all of that. Let's make sure that this date does not have those weird zeros in front of it. So let's make this a short date. Let's label this as time. And then we're going to cut B and paste it over there. And then we're going to duplicate or copy all of that over there. My deer activity, minimum, maximum temperature, and so forth. And then copy it back over here. Great, and so for date, we're going to be removing the duplicates and do our sum if function, and we're also going to be adding our average temperature over here. What I do recommend doing is adding a few more columns here. In fact, let me go ahead and close out of this format shape here. I don't need that. It's just adding more clutter to my view over here that I already don't need. So I'm going to go ahead and copy all of this, all of these columns here. Copy. And then, you know what? In fact, what I'm going to do is I don't need all of these duplicated. I'm just going to cut these and paste these over here, and then just duplicate date and deer activity. And I think that should be good enough. So we're going to go ahead and select all of these, go all the way down, data, remove duplicates, and my data does have headers. That's what's great about it. It allows me to keep all of this stuff organized. I'm going to deselect all of these and just have my date available here. All right, so we've removed all the duplicates and we have our unique values that remain. I'm going to remove this deer activity. And before moving forward, I do want to add this additional average temperature function here. Average temperature, and then do this equals average, whoops, and then that column, or that cell, double click the bottom here, and then this time around I can get these numbers a little closer here. This way I don't have all of that stuff over to the right too far over there. And now I'm going to check for my deer activity, so I'm going to do this sum if function. What's my range? My range is this date over here. Control Shift down. My criteria is going to be this over here, and then my sum range is going to be this over here. Now, as you may recall, we're going to do this $sign operator, $sign. Just make sure you don't put the $sign in front of the criteria, because that is going to be changing. And then double click downwards. And look at that, we have all of our ranges correctly done. Great, and as you may recall, before we could have just easily copy and pasted all that deer activity in there, but I just wanted to show that one more time.